By the time the Germans did the Bulge in December of 1944, Antwerp had been opened by the Americans, but supplies were still not forthcoming because Monty was demanding all available supplies for his march towards Berlin through Hanover. The Ruhr manufacturing district was on the Rhine River, 75 miles by waterway from Arnhem, and Monty wanted to bypass the Ruhr and leave the Americans behind while he headed northwards into Hanover and thence straight to Berlin. Churchill leaned to military action in Holland, prompted by Dutch warnings that all pumping installations, locks, sluices, and dikes were being rigged with explosives. But fighting through the myriad canals and waterways could consume weeks, and British troops were not available both to march into Western Holland and to sustain an offensive to Denmark. Throughout, Eisenhower directed a stream of messages to Montgomery and Brooke to nudge Montgomery. As early as the 8th, within 96 hours of Simpson's transfer back to Bradley, Eisenhower had pronounced himself ready to lend American support for Montgomery's Denmark push. Eisenhower now informed Montgomery that he was quietly building up a Schaeff reserve in case Montgomery encountered an quote-unquote unanticipated need, and that he had shifted supply priorities over the Wesel rail bridges to fuel the British dash for Lübeck. When Monty continued to procrastinate, Eisenhower dangled a push on to Berlin with sacrifices and honors equally shared if the German capital fell within the orbit of Allied successes, a move rejected all week by Montgomery as, quote, useless and too late. Eisenhower at War, page 758 and 9. On the 5th of December in 1944, the Germans had sent the submarine U-864 to Japan with Messerschmitt jet engines on board so the Japanese could begin producing Japanese fighter planes powered by Messerschmitt jet engines. And the Germans had included all the blueprints and instructions for building V-2 rockets. On the 6th of February, a British submarine torpedoed U-864, and the Norwegians would later cover the wreck with hundreds of thousands of tons of rocks and sand to seal the U-boat's contents inside. Hitler went on the radio on the 30th of January and told everyone to hang on, and the thinking in the German General Staff revolved around the idea that Napoleon's last great victory on German soil had been at Dresden, and that Napoleon had easily taken Hanover away from the British. The first British air raid by the RAF had been on Hanover the day after Britain declared war on Germany, and that had been a single RAF plane dropping leaflets on the capital city of Hanover with two N's. Hanover, with two N's. The final British Operation ECLIPSE meant to put the British in charge of Hanover and northwest Germany while the Americans were kept down south in reserve so they could be turned like trained dogs against Russia under British command, and a map and plans of ECLIPSE were sent to Germany from Monty's headquarters, but had been captured by the Americans during the Bulge. Monty claimed those plans for ECLIPSE were a forgery, but a duplicate had already been delivered to the Americans by the Germans before the Bulge, seeking arrangements for all the young German soldiers being held as POWs. And so FDR had drawn up a map of his own, putting the Americans where the British wanted to be and sending Monty down to Strasbourg so the French could yell at him a little. France had fought in the Great War to get Alsace back, but in Hitler's war, the French and Strasbourg preferred Germany to the British choice of de Gaulle. The Russians had been 50 miles away from Berlin when, according to an RAF memo issued to airmen the night before attacking the city of Dresden, they were not to hit the surrounding industrial and manufacturing areas, and the primary purpose of the raid was to, quote, show the Russians when they arrive what Bomber Command can do, close quote. At the British briefing for the bombing of Dresden, the Polish airmen in the RAF were told about the Yalta Agreement and were informed that FDR had given Poland to the Russians 3 days earlier at the Crimea Conference. And Dresden was firebombed on the 13th and 15th of February, 3 days after Monty was given his American troops to prevent it. Monty used 50,000 men and 5,000 tanks for Veritable that had been launched on the 8th of February, and when the dams were blown, the river rose 2 feet per hour, flooding the valley downstream for those 2 weeks and stranding the Americans while Monty advanced across dry land and Hitler ordered his troops to stand fast. After taking Hanover away from Germany, Napoleon had won his last big battle at Dresden in 1813 and was finally beaten at Leipzig, just 60 miles west of Dresden, and that had been his last stand in Germany. While Patton was making plans to march on Leipzig, bombs were dropped on Dresden for 14 hours, and it would take 10 years to clear away the rubble. The Germans knew all about Veritable and had been giving warnings broadcast over the radio about the upcoming paratrooper drops and when and where, and said that they were ready. And the British Operation Grenade began the day after Veritable. That was said to be an American crossing of the Roer River, but they were unable to move forward until the 23rd of February when the flooding finally subsided. The Germans west of the Rhine during Veritable and Grenade lost 40,000 casualties with 50,000 surrendering, while the Allies lost 23,000 men. And on the 10th of February, Bradley had telephoned Patton to tell him about losing the 17th Airborne and the 95th Infantry Division to Monty when the British were threatening to bomb Dresden. Because as Veritable got underway, the Russians had started their Silesian offensive after crossing the Oder River on the 8th of February, and Monty was demanding more American troops to march on to Berlin before the Russians got there. 1 year to the day that FDR had spoken to America over the radio about his demand for unconditional surrender, setting forth the American policy that no separate peace deals would be tolerated, the British ordered the firebombing of Dresden on that day. Hitler's favorite, Frederick II the Great, had beaten Maria Theresa's army in 1745, 5 miles outside Dresden, and then had become the hero of the 7 Years' War with his victory in 1757 on a battlefield 20 miles outside Dresden. And the 7 Years' War was won because the British had switched sides to join with the Prussians, and told them where all the enemy camps and supplies were, and Dresden was on the Elbe River, 40 miles south of Torgau. And as the Americans were marching into Germany, Hitler was broadcasting Wagner's Frederick the Great over the radio. There were only 2 bridges left across the Rhine in February of 1945, the bridge at Remagen and the Wesel Railroad Bridge. And Wesel was 50 miles downstream from Cologne and 40 miles upstream from Arnhem. The British destroyed Wesel completely from the air on the 16th and 19th of February, and what was left of the city would be shelled again on the 23rd of March for Operation Plunder, and bombed again from the air for Operation Varsity that cleared the way for plunder. Churchill personally showed up the night before Varsity, stopping into Ike's headquarters for lunch, and then took Monty on a small boat across the Rhine and stood in Germany for a half an hour, which was the point of plunder, to cross the Rhine near Dusseldorf and the Dutch border. Monty's army crossed the Rhine on the 23rd of March under cover of artificial fog, and Ike had decided on the 15th of March to no longer support the British plans for a single thrust. The British newspapers had been reporting on Monty's glorious march to the Rhine, but on the 7th of March, Patton had captured the bridge across the Rhine at Remagen and had taken 25,000 American soldiers across by the time of plunder. And the bridge at Remagen stayed up until the 17th of March, giving Patton enough time to use it for 10 days, even though he had also built another 2 bridges downstream. And 6 of Patton's divisions were across the Rhine when Hitler promulgated his scorched earth command on the 19th of March. When a British 21st Army Group logistical study indicated that Monty could support no more than 21 divisions in that northern offensive, Schaeff had arbitrarily ordered the estimate increased, first to 30 and then 36. Our southern pincer was to be limited to approximately 12 divisions. The remainder of the Allied divisions on the Western Front were then to dig in and hold on the near bank of the Rhine. Bradley, page 502. While Varsity was the largest and the last parachute drop of the war, setting 20,000 soldiers down near Wesel. It had been done in full daylight so the British press could take good photos, and the daylight drop allowed the Germans to shoot up half the gliders on their slow descent and hit the rest in something of a skeet shoot for the well-trained Germans who inflicted 2,000 casualties, after which 3,500 of them would surrender. A further 30,000 Germans would surrender in the following week, and the newspapers got their story and their statistics, although an American parachute division had quote-unquote accidentally landed right on top of the British division in their zone and had escaped enemy fire upon landing, and had thus escaped enemy fire upon landing. And that was not luck, but the result of having just flown through intense German anti-aircraft fire that had missed the British planes but hit 60 American planes. On the day of plunder, the British won back Burma for Britain, linking it to India again, and that was the best effort and most remarkable feat for the British in the entire war. India was a vast supply depot from which America's Lend-Lease program had been buying trucks and ammunition and food, sending it from India to Russia. And the British had built over 40,000 miles of railroads in India by the 1930s. And Britain promised the Indians dominion status, but not independence, for their cooperation in the war effort. At the end of June after D-Day in 1944, the bulk of the Canadian Army and the Poles and the Indian troops had arrived in the British sector in Normandy, and they were called Dominion troops. And the Indians in India had been training since 1938, 3 divisions organized as armored, even though they had no tanks in India with which to practice. Dominion troops came from Australia and Africa and Canada and India and New Zealand, as well as various smaller colonies. And India had endless numbers of people who could be turned into soldiers, although India had been agitating for independence since 1935. The British trained 130,000 Indian troops in 1939 and added another 200,000 by the summer of 1940. And by 1945, there were 2.5 million soldiers carrying arms for Britain, an easy recruitment program using the Lend-Lease money with its lure of great wages. And there had been 4,500 British officers in India in 1939, with 500 of them natives of India. The general understanding in Britain was that Americans were simply colonial British, and Monty looked at the Americans the same as other Dominion troops, and he treated America as just another rebellious colony. British colonial masters expected to be treated with the utmost deference by the locals, and were horrified at the familiarity practiced by Americans who called it equality while the British called it communism. FDR hated colonialism and the misery it brought to native populations and to the foreigners shipped in to work for them as slaves, and when Americans used the word freedom, the British thought it meant empire. And when Americans used the words private enterprise, the British thought it meant privateering or piracy, with the freedom to take freely from others, or downright clear-cut thievery. Britain and America were two brothers born of a common language, sharing the same mother while the younger would rule the elder. And the French had taken a different tack by attempting to turn their colonials into French citizens, and that usually didn't work out very well for France. Washington had crossed the Delaware to turn his back on his former British masters, and Washington escaped across the river not just militarily but also socially, because the British had looked down on Washington for consorting with commoners and black folk and drunken Hessians. And in the boat with Washington as he crossed the Delaware was his friend and aide of African origin. Washington had been more of a commoner, while the British believed in being well-dressed and snobby, and while Patton was a stickler for uniform protocol, he was also a common American, and as soon as Patton was successful in Sicily, the British newspapers started smearing him for slapping a soldier because the British had strict rules about not abusing servants, and to British officers the English soldier was a servant who should never be slapped. There was something about Americans that Germans liked, and Clarence Coggins had been captured by a German patrol near Grenoble on the 23rd of August in 1944, and managed to convince the Germans that their cause was lost, and 2 days later he persuaded over 1,000 of them to surrender. Stalin knew that with so many German soldiers surrendering to the West, Russia could be in real trouble if the POWs were allowed to join with Monty against him, and so Stalin urged his armies on towards Berlin with all haste, which is why, for the most part, the Russians had bypassed the Seelow Heights on the 16th of April, bent on getting to Berlin before Monty could beat them to it and get his separate peace signed. The Americans met the Russians at Torgau on the Elbe on the 25th of April. On the riverfront of the desolate city of Torgau, where a bombed railroad bridge slumped across the Elbe, a company of Russian officers waited to convoy us to Konev. A crude bridge had been thrown across the river, and teamsters were snaking timber from the nearby forests to repair the railroad span. A crudely fashioned pile driver chugged in the middle of the stream. Except for the steam engine on that pile driver, Russian methods had not changed since the time Peter the Great of Russia had massed his armies at Torgau almost 200 years before to march with the Austrians against Frederick the Great. Bradley, page 536. Collins met us at Leipzig and convoyed us through the corridor to Torgau. He had made the trip himself almost a week before, and while en route to the Soviet lines, was asked if he would object to seeing a division commander. Of course not, he answered, and the column turned off to where a Soviet division occupied a position facing us. The division commander was apologetic. "May I ask you a question?" he said. "Go ahead," Collins replied. "Are your people digging in opposite us?" "Digging in?" Collins looked startled. "Why, of course not. After all, we're allies, you know." The Red commander called for a staff officer. "Cancel that order to dig in," he said. Bradley, Ibid. A conference would be held in Geneva in the summer of 1955, where Ike would give Zhukov a spinning reel for fishing, and that year Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev was a metal fitter born in a small Russian town where he worked in a coal mine with his father. Khrushchev enjoyed reading Zola's Germinal and the writing of Karl Marx because they described his own working experience. And Khrushchev had labored side by side in the coal pit in 1915 with prisoners from the Great War and had discovered brotherhood with the Slavs from Czechoslovakia captured and sent there as POWs. The Russians would get along famously with the French pilots serving alongside them on the Eastern Front during Hitler's war, and the coal mine where Khrushchev had worked with his father had been owned by the French. There is no green on the mountain after dark. Sulphur is in the wind then, and the sky is red with furnace glare all over the ridges. From the valley comes the singing of the Irish and the screaming of the babies. They have 19 to the dozen. The lights of the Gindarnis Inn go on, the workers crowd in for beer, and an hour later hell is let loose with their fighting. The Rape of the Fair Country by Alexander Cordell, New York, Bantam Books, Doubleday and Company, Inc., 1959-1960, page 2. "Back there!" shouted a ladle man, and the crowd spread to a wide circle to watch the liquid iron coming out. Great is the ingenuity of man, that he digs rock from a mountain and boils it into iron. The firebox door swung back, and there was a blaze of white heat as the flames curled up in smokeless red and gold. The people shielded their eyes from the glare as the plug was knocked out. I saw the lip of the moving iron, sheet white at first, reluctant as it struck the misted air. Steam rolled as it took its first wet breath from the mountain, a hiss, a sigh, and it was down, down, a writhing globule of red life flashing at the plug. Black it turned, the white water in pursuit of the impure in the sand mold, popping, cracking, its fingers diverting into flaring streams. Flame gathered along the molds, and a shining bed expired into a mist of purple, growing rigid in shape and color to live for 1,000 years. The furnace roared, the sand mold hissed, the plug was sealed, the firebox belched relief. Rape of the Fair Country, page 20. After the Geneva meetings got underway, Eisenhower suggested that after each plenary session we meet for refreshments so that we might end the day on a pleasant note. His idea was that if there had been any hard feelings or tensions aroused during the day's session, we could wash them away with martinis. I remember at one of these informal gatherings, Eisenhower introduced me to Nelson Rockefeller. Nelson in brackets. I remember at one of these informal gatherings, Eisenhower introduced me to Rockefeller, who was accompanying the American delegation as an advisor of some sort. There was nothing special about him as far as I could tell. He was dressed fairly democratically and was the sort of man who didn't make much of an impression one way or the other. When I met him, I said, "So this is Mr. Rockefeller himself," and I playfully poked him in the ribs with my fists. He took this as a joke and did the same thing to me. Khrushchev Remembers by Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, New York, Little Brown and Company, 1970, page 399. Roosevelt and Stalin had a common antipathy for monarchy and its institutions. Once he told me about the following episode. When they were in Tehran sitting over dinner, Roosevelt raised his glass and proposed a toast to the President of the Soviet Union. "Mr. Kalinin." Everyone drank, and after a few moments Churchill raised his glass and proposed a toast to the King of Great Britain. Roosevelt said he wouldn't drink that toast. Churchill's back went up, but Roosevelt was firm. "No," he said, "I won't drink. I cannot drink to an English king. I can never forget my father's words." Stalin explained that when Roosevelt's father left for America from England or Ireland, he said on the boat to the young Roosevelt, "The king is our enemy." Roosevelt had never forgotten his father's contempt for the King of England. Despite all the requirements of etiquette, Roosevelt didn't raise his glass. Khrushchev Remembers, page 223. After the Napoleonic Wars, the British monarch had also been called the King of Hanover in 1814. And the Kingdom of Hanover had ended in 1866 when it was annexed by Prussia. and the British King of Hanover had been forced into exile in Austria. Hanover would remain a province of Prussia until 1946. Before Napoleon had taken it away from them, England had owned the entire Hanover region, an area 150 miles in diameter that included the port of Hamburg, where the Elbe River meets the North Sea. The Mittelland Canal flowed from Antwerp to Berlin, and the halfway point was the town of Minden, with its terrible memories of the English razing the countryside to become victorious over the French on the first day of August in 1759, because the French forces had been called away to another front. The 7 Years' War had been Prussia, led by Frederick the Great, allied with Britain, and they went to war against Russia, France, Austria, Hungary, Sweden, Spain, and Saxony. But the 7 Years' War had actually begun 17 years earlier with Maria Theresa's War, where Britain had been allied with Austria rather than with Austria's enemy Prussia. Because the British had been Austria's ally since 1731, they'd been able to inspect all the Austrian troop camps and supply stations and battle plans and military and transport capabilities, and while Britain helped Maria Theresa keep her Austrian throne at the end of the war in 1748, they took away her family's land in Silesia after her final victory, even though Silesia had been the cause of the war in the first place. The fight was also over Hanover, and when Britain switched sides to ally with Prussia against Maria Theresa for the 7 Years' War, that she had started to get Silesia back, the British knew that Frederick the Great would allow Britain to keep Hanover in exchange for Silesia, and in the first few years of the 7 Years' War, Prussia had soundly defeated France, but the tide turned when France badly beat Frederick the Great and Berlin was occupied by Russians for weeks, while Germany was invaded by Austrians from the south. Frederick the Great was running low on soldiers, and the French were preparing their fleet at Brest to invade England, but the Anglo-Hanoverian army stepped in to defeat the French and occupied the town of Münster, and all of a sudden, the Russian Tsarina died, and Russia pulled out of the war, when Peter III replaced the dead Tsarina, and Peter III was a friend and a fan of the Prussian Frederick the Great. The Tsarina had been suffering dizzy spells and refusing to take the medicines they were giving her, and she had a stroke on Christmas Eve and died on Christmas Day at the age of 52. And Peter III's Russians immediately joined with the Prussians to win the war for Frederick the Great. Stalin had been doing his best to purge Russia of the English and their Anglophiles, ally or not, and he knew them well enough to hold back in 1944 before liberating Warsaw to see how the British negotiators would make out with their secret parleys to Hitler, about which Stalin was continually briefed in depth by sympathizers such as Kim Philby. Austria had been beaten at the Battle of Berkersdorf, 17 miles away from Dresden, after the Russians switched sides when the Tsarina died, and then Russia had graciously pulled out of Poland and given it to the victorious Prussians, and then returned home to Russia to finalize peace talks for the end of the 7 Years' War, and that had left Britain the ruler of the seas and the foremost colonial power on planet Earth. Frederick II the Great had been the British Hanoverian George II's nephew, and Frederick II the Great had captured Dresden, while the Russians had been unable to take Prussia's capital of Königsberg. And as the result of the 7 Years' War, France was forced to recognize the legitimacy of the House of Hanover, and to the British, control of Hanover meant that they could keep Russia out of the North Sea by blockading the Danish Straits. Instead of trying to beat the Americans during the 7 Years' War, Britain had concentrated on defending their sugar plantations in the West Indies in the Caribbean Sea, so they could keep making rum, and the American Indians would be severely punished by the British for their double-dealing complicity with the French during the 7 Years' War. Königsberg in Prussian meant the King's Mountain, and the last major battle of the 7 Years' War had been fought at Torgau on the Elbe River in November of 1960, where 20,000 Austrians had been killed by Britain's ally Prussia. Torgau was 50 miles downstream on the Elbe River from Dresden, and Magdeburg was 80 miles downstream on the Elbe from Torgau, and another 150 miles downstream on the Elbe from Magdeburg was Hamburg, and the RAF bombed Magdeburg on the 16th of January in 1945, killing several thousand people, and Magdeburg was halfway between Hanover and Berlin by land. The darkest day in the history of warfare had been when all the villagers in Magdeburg had been massacred by the Catholics and their imperialist allies on the 20th of May in 1631, leaving only 500 people alive out of the 25,000 who had lived there, and Magdeburg's cathedral was where the first German Holy Roman Emperor Otto I was buried. At the Congress of Vienna, Hanover was given back all its territory west of the Elbe. The British held on to Malta and the key of the route to India, the Cape of Good Hope. The main preoccupation of the powers was to draw a cordon sanitaire around France to protect Central Europe from the infections and dangers of revolution. Churchill's History, page 383. After Napoleon's victory at Tilsit in 1807, Napoleon had met with the Russian emperor on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River to make a deal, and the result of that meeting was that Napoleon was free to fight the British in the Peninsular War, where Wellington would pay the enemy in gold to allow him to escape unharmed, and in February of 1945, a plane had taken off from Germany with 2 billion illegally printed French francs on board, but it exploded and saved the French economy. From the British perspective, Market Garden had not been a failure, because Monty got his American Dominion troops under his command, and he got them poised to march into Hanover on his way to Berlin, while all the other Americans were strung out thinly and being starved for ammo and gasoline as all supplies were being funneled to Monty. Having crossed the Rhine on the 23rd of March in a small boat with Churchill to stand in Germany for a half hour, nobody had come halfway to meet Monty during their Operation Plunder, and so they launched Operation Archway on the 25th of March. That was 300 SAS in 100 armed jeeps with supporting trucks sent across the Rhine into northern Germany, with 700 more SAS sent on the 7th of April for Operation Amherst. As the SAS spread out to make contact with Germans, some were delayed at Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April, and others didn't reach their objectives until the end of April, while many of the SAS abandoned their missions to head towards Dresden, where they joined with other SAS agents looking for their first commander, David Stirling, who was being held prisoner in the Colditz Castle near Dresden, a castle that had been used as a mental hospital for the incurably insane for the past 100 years. The Americans had captured Colditz Castle on the 16th of April, and 2 days later captured the monument to the Battle of the Nations in Leipzig that had been built in honor of Napoleon's defeat. And the huge monument had a statue of Michael the Archangel out front, known as the guardian of Germans in battle. The SAS were having more trouble wearing German uniforms in Germany than they had in France, where they had gotten away with it more often. And Stirling had started the SAS with a code of utmost secrecy that the Americans had been less likely to appreciate. Stirling's commandos were trained to commit spying and sabotage, and they were able to call in airstrikes on uncooperative Frenchmen or Americans or Germans, and the SAS would blow up warehouses and train tracks and command posts, and the SAS were the primary weapon in Monty's control of the flow of supplies. SAS sabotage would be blamed on the French, who then suffered reprisals from the Germans, such as when 99 civilians were hanged in Toul on the 9th of June in 1944, and when the SAS killed 40 Germans in Oradour-sur-Glane. The Germans in reprisal murdered 700 French civilians trying to find the SAS, and both the French and the Germans stayed on the hunt for the SAS, whose activities remain to this day a closely guarded secret. The SAS had started in Normandy with Operation Bullbasket on the 6th of June for D-Day, but Bullbasket had been ordered back to England on the 24th of July. And the SAS had been sent in the following day for Operation Gaff. The SAS was called Churchill's Secret Army, and they had killed Heydrich in May of 1942, and they would try to kill Hitler unsuccessfully several times. The SAS had been in charge of Operation Tiger in April of 1944 that had ostensibly been rehearsals for the D-Day landings, and Tiger was held on Slapton Sands in England, where 30,000 Americans were supposed to practice the beach landing for D-Day. But Tiger ended in the death of almost 800 Americans because of the similarity between Slapton Sands and the Normandy beaches. Hitler was assured that the D-Day landings would be in Normandy. On the first day of Tiger, the British fired a naval bombardment on the Americans on the beach, murdering over 200 of them and proving to Hitler that the British were willing to kill Americans. And on the second day of Tiger, the Americans opened fire on some German E-boats watching nearby, and the Germans torpedoed 2 of the American landing craft, and the British said they could not help any Americans because the British Navy was using different radio frequencies, while over 600 Americans died, and a third ship was set on fire that killed over 100 men, and a fourth was damaged by friendly fire, while many of the Americans died in the cold water, waiting to be rescued. The day before the Americans captured Colditz Castle, the German submarine U-234 left for Japan on the 15th of April, carrying a complete Messerschmitt jet and a Henschel radio-controlled glide bomb with a rocket engine, and the captain of the U-234 sailed to America to surrender rather than become a prisoner of the British. Hitler's hero, Frederick the Great, had invaded Silesia on the 16th of December in 1740 with a commander named von Schwerin, who won the Battle of Mollwitz on the 10th of April in 1741. And Hitler had appointed another General von Schwerin to be in charge of Aachen in September of 1944, while Monty was doing Market Garden, and Aachen was supposed to stay in von Schwerin's hands until Monty could arrange the separate peace with his Market Garden. But as the Americans approached Aachen and many of the German officials and officers fled, Hitler had them sent to the Eastern Front. There was a statue of Frederick the Great's General von Schwerin in Berlin, whose motto had been, "The Prussian army always attacks," and so Hitler had used him to justify being always on the offensive. And Hitler's horoscope had said that he would have a huge reversal of fortune from very bad to extremely good in the second half of April. And then Hitler got his miracle just the same as Frederick the Great had when the enemy's leader died right in the middle of Germany's darkest hour. The American president, FDR, died on the 12th of April, and it was assumed by the British that the Americans would be in disarray and mourning and confusion over FDR's death. So by the time they buried FDR and sorted out the succession, all the German POWs could be given back their weapons with fresh ammo and infused with renewed hope that they could stop the Russians heading for Berlin. And then the American troops would have no choice but to join them because U.S. soldiers would be impossibly outnumbered as Germany was marching with Monty's Dominion troops. Unfortunately for the Germans, the chain of command in the U.S. Army gave generals more flexibility than in the German chain of command, so Ike did not need permission from FDR to act, and could make decisions on his own without presidential permission, while the Germans were not allowed to make a move without an explicit okay from Hitler. Monty had never fully embraced the reality that Ike was the supreme commander, expecting Monty to follow orders from Ike, and Monty felt his quote-unquote single thrust idea was supported by the board of directors at SHAEF, so rejecting orders from Ike or bypassing any directives Monty saw as contradictory was fair game in Monty's mind, and he continually gave mere lip service to General Eisenhower, and in turn would be awarded with responses and letters from the Supreme Commander that kept up the appearance that the Americans were working together with the British. While Ike publicly pretended to be in sync with his British counterparts, it was for the most part simply maintaining a charade, lest the whole thing spin completely out of control, pushing the British to operate openly alongside the German army, fatally endangering American troops, since the battlefield was its own world, where guns were more powerful than paper. While the telephone had been a powerful tool, it could also be blamed for Hitler's downfall because it put him in direct contact with his ground forces and their commanders. Thus, they necessarily had to hesitate at crucial moments when immediate action would have saved the day. The Americans were constantly on the move, while Monty continually insisted on keeping his lines quote-unquote neat and tidy. And Monty would give up territory already won so that he could make his boundaries more straight and clear, allowing the enemy to know exactly where he stood. On the 19th of April, the German radio announced that a separate peace had been arranged between Himmler and Great Britain and the United States, in that order. But they reported that the Russians were refusing to agree to the peace. FDR had died the week before of a heart attack, and the American War of Independence had begun on the 19th of April in 1775, and on the 4th of April, the American Third Army had overrun Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, and Patton demanded that the world know about Buchenwald despite the British insisting these camps be kept secret. The Germans had been evacuating concentration camps in front of the Russians, so they'd been told that Patton would not be coming anywhere. Oh, and the Germans had been evacuating concentration camps in front of the Russians, but they'd been told that Patton would not be coming anywhere near Ohrdruf. So the inadequate attempts to move those prisoners away and to burn the camps had been more terrible than successful. And after Ike saw what had been going on in the prison camps in Germany, the recriminations towards Patton for having tried to liberate the compound where his son-in-law was being held were immediately lifted. Patton had sent over 300 men and 16 tanks with supporting vehicles on the 26th of March behind enemy lines over 50 miles to liberate the camp, but his mission had failed with only 35 men coming back and all vehicles lost. Patton would say later that he should have sent 3 times that amount of manpower. And while transportation was an utmost necessity for the war effort, just as necessary was the flow of information through the public news media. And so the American Edward R. Murrow's broadcast his report from Buchenwald on the 15th of April, and while Murrow had been broadcasting from the BBC studios to America, working for CBS News, Murrow's reports had been completely controlled by the censors at Britain's Ministry of Information. After word got out about Buchenwald, all bets were off. The British had reached Bergen-Belsen on the 11th of April and made a deal with Himmler that allowed the Germans to continue to manage the camp and set up an exclusion zone 5 miles wide around it to prevent the spread of typhus. Unfortunately for that deal, an SAS officer with his jeep driver accidentally stumbled on the camp and blew the whistle. So the British Army had to take over Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April, where 20,000 Russian POWs had died. Bergen-Belsen was right near Celle, that was 20 miles north of the ancient capital of Hanover. And the British 11th Armoured found 13,000 corpses and 60,000 walking skeletons in Bergen-Belsen, and these British soldiers would later have the privilege of arresting the Flensburg government. Operation Lumberjack had begun for the Americans on the 1st of March in 1945, with Patton's Third Army, along with Bradley's First Army, going after Cologne. But Monty had told the Americans to stay on the west bank of the Rhine and to clear out both the Eifel Mountains and the Moselle Valley, where there were over 75,000 German soldiers. And this was the task Monty had given the Americans, while the British marched ahead up north across the Rhine towards Berlin. However, American generals had freedom of decision on the ground, as opposed to the British and German method of tightly held reins, just as Western horses were allowed to think for themselves while English riders were required to control the animal's every move. During Lumberjack, the Americans suffered 100 casualties to the Germans' 5,700 killed and wounded. And Patton had interpreted his orders as, quote, aggressive defense, close quote, and, quote, moving towards the Rhine with a low profile, close quote, using, quote, armored reconnaissance, close quote, with his 7 divisions now supplied through Dragoon. And Patton told Ike that moving forward was just training exercises for the new troops. On the 5th of March, Ike unleashed Patton to go ahead into the rest of the Rhineland, because as soon as Monty found out about Lumberjack, he sent the RAF on the 3rd of March to bomb the historic Bezuidenhout neighborhood near The Hague, even though Monty claimed to have been targeting V-2 rocket launchers in a park a half-mile to the west, but said the RAF had suffered from navigational errors. By the 10th of March, Patton had advanced 55 miles in less than 48 hours, just 3 days after seizing the bridge at Remagen. And Patton called Bradley and said, "For God's sake, tell the world we're across. I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty." However, Bradley's headquarters had already made that announcement, and Bradley had also told the press corps, emphasizing that it had been accomplished, quote, without benefit of aerial bombing, ground smoke, artillery preparation, and airborne assistance, close quote. It had been reported to us that our adjacent corps to the south had just succeeded in capturing the Remagen Railroad Bridge across the Rhine River and captured it intact. This was welcome news. My battalion commander dispatched me with 2 of our forward observers to cross the Rhine and establish an observation post to adjust our artillery fire. When I reached the bridge, which was 3 or 4 hours after its capture, the west side was cluttered with vehicles trying to cross the river. Many of these people had a mission on the east bank, but additionally there was a great number of gawkers and spectators who simply wanted to cross for posterity's sake. I explained my mission to the officer in charge and received permission for almost an immediate crossing. I did have time enough to ask how the bridge was captured, and received the answer that later became historic news. An engineer lieutenant with several enlisted men ran across the bridge, kicking and throwing explosive charges into the river below. Never knowing when the Germans would activate their detonator, this was an extremely brave act. At any moment during the 10 or 15 minutes it took to accomplish this task, all of them could have been blown to kingdom come. We crossed the bridge and established 2 observation posts on the east bank. I left the 2 observers with their food and equipment. I then recrossed the bridge. Several days later the bridge collapsed as a result of previous bombing, but by that time we had finished 2 bridges downriver from the Remagen Bridge. The first bridge was a pontoon bridge, constructed by 2 engineer battalions. My corps commander offered to provide beer for the men of these battalions if they could give him a bridge in less than 12 hours. They did, and he did. However, the bridge was a sight to behold. They worked so rapidly that some of the pontoon anchors slipped, causing the total bridge to be a series of S-curves, a sort of zigzag across the Rhine River. It was sturdy, however, permitting traffic as soon as it was completed. The bridge was well named Beer Bridge, and served well for many weeks. A Journey Through Memory by Robert W. Clierhue, San Francisco, Robert W. Clierhue, 1995, page 77 and 8. The navigation of the Rhine at Cologne is very important for the exportation of the produce of all the states, situated on either bank from its very source. Cologne is the principal entrepôt. The river in this place is 1,300 feet wide, and from 25 to 50 feet deep. Vessels going hence to Holland have frequently double the cargo which has been brought down the river to this place, and the final shipments for the sea take place in this port. From hence the navigation is uniform, uninterrupted, and free from danger. If his business takes him to Frankfort, a 4th steam vessel is ready to convey him to that place on the same day, as 2 such vessels perform that distance twice daily. Or if Switzerland be the point of direction, the Frederick Wilhelm steamer will convey him to Strasbourg in 44 hours, from whence, plunging into the Black Forest, a short journey by land takes him into the very heart of Switzerland. Such are the wonderful performances of steam in navigation! A man may breakfast in London on Saturday, take his supper at the Romish Kaiser on the Thursday evening following at Frankfurt, and dine in some Swiss canton on the succeeding Sunday! And all this at the moderate expense of from $40 to $56, or at the very utmost 10 guineas. Who will not travel? St. Petersburg, a journey of travels to and from that capital, through Flanders, the Rhenish provinces, Prussia, Russia, Poland, Silesia, Saxony, the Federated States of Germany and France, in 2 volumes by A. B. Granville, M.D., London, Henry Colburn, New Burlington Street, 2nd edition, Volume 1, 1829, page 114 and 15. There are in Frankfurt 4 churches of the Roman Catholic confession, including Notre Dame, and 6 for the Lutheran service. The Romer is an assemblage of irregular buildings of various dates, purchased by the government at different periods, constituting what in other cities is styled the Hotel de Ville. The only remarkable parts of this grotesque structure are the great banqueting hall, in which the coronation dinner given to the newly elected emperor used to take place, and the archives of the city, where the celebrated charter, the Bulla Aurea, or Golden Bull, is preserved. Around the banqueting hall, the portraits of the emperors since Conrad I are still visible, painted in fresco on the wall. The Golden Bull is a venerable document written on parchment, measuring several feet in length, and passed in the year 1356, during the reign of the Emperor Charles IV. It settles the matter of electing the emperor, fixes the number of electors, declares the dignity of electors to be equal to that of kings, and constitutes high treason every attempt or conspiracy against their persons. By one of its enactments, the place of election is fixed at Frankfurt, and that of the coronation at Aix-la-Chapelle, known in the German as Aachen. St. Petersburg, A Journey of Travels, page 160 and 61. In our rambles over the town, the old palace of the Knights of the Teutonic Order was pointed out, with its singular chapel standing near the bridge in Sachsenhausen. As a matter of curiosity, we were tempted to extend our airing to that part of the town where all the Jews reside. The principal street of this insulated quarter, situated at the east end of the town, bears the name of Judengasse, is extremely narrow and very filthy. Floors piled upon floors to the number of 9 or 10 are to be seen in each of the countless houses made of wood and black from age, from which form the street. It was actually swarming with the unshaven, the circumcised, and their kindred, stationed before and at the doors of their rag shops in a state of filth which beggars description. How epidemical disorders are not engendered in such a place is a matter to me of some surprise. The undeviating and uniform identity of the features and general character of the countenance, which accompany these singular people wherever they settle, is certainly one of the most curious phenomena in nature. Climate, and all those physical circumstances belonging to localities which work such wonderful changes in the physical character of man, and are, as much as any other influential agent, the cause of those differences which constitute races, appear to have no influence upon the tribe of Israel. The circumcised of Monmouth Street is like that of Judengasse, as two individuals of the same nation can be, let them be by birth and residence German, English, Russian, Portuguese, or Polish. Still the one and only set of features belonging to the race will be seen equally in all. St. Petersburg, A Journey of Travels, page 173 and 74. Indeed, Eisenhower would not approve the First Army portion of Lumberjack until March 3, 1 week after Lumberjack had started, and only then orally and upon a firm understanding that Patton, after seizing Trier, would swing major forces southeast over the Moselle. Not until March 13, 6 days after Bradley's seizure of a Rhine bridgehead at Remagen, would Eisenhower approve Lumberjack in writing. Bradley would hail Eisenhower's action as, quote, one of the most significant orders of the war, close quote. A major shift in plan ordered without approval of the combined chiefs, though the record does not bear him out. Eisenhower at War, page 674. The Germans' Operation Spring Awakening in Hungary began on the 6th of March and kicked off in response to the Americans' Lumberjack. And Spring Awakening only lasted 10 days and used German troops who had escaped from the Bulge. And it would be the last German offensive in the east, but would fail to keep the Russians out of Hungary. 8 out of 10 soldiers dead in the war were Russian, and Zhukov had over 1 million men, only 30 miles east of Berlin. Spring Awakening was supposed to be a revanche or resurrection of the British Operation Spring that had failed when Hitler survived the 20th of July plot. And for Spring Awakening, Himmler sent Sepp Dietrich and his refurbished 6th Panzer Division to Hungary to get ready for Monty's separate peace. Hungary was basically northern Yugoslavia and was a little smaller than Kentucky, and Sepp Dietrich was sent 200 miles north of Belgrade to prepare for the pushback against the Russians that would begin as Zhukov was steamrolling over Berlin, and that was supposed to horrify the Americans into turning against Russia. As soon as Hitler was certifiably dead at the hands of the Russians, the war would be over, and the new German government, with its headquarters at Vienna, could watch as Stalin's army was conquered and thrown out of Berlin, and Goering had been in Vienna preparing to strike up a partnership with the Americans. As British war planners huddled over their maps, Kim Philby stayed near his telephone, and the big question foremost in everyone's mind was, why weren't the Russians moving towards Berlin? Just as the Americans in southern Germany were reaching the Elbe at Torgau, Hitler was reading Carlyle's Frederick the Great over the radio, and a large part of Frederick the Great's success had been due to his encouragement of Jewish scholars allowed to participate in the government. These Jews had taught Arabic numbers and algebra to German students, and they had counseled Frederick the Great to issue notes stamped on leather rather than using only gold coins for money. Himmler waited at Schneidemühl until the 13th of March, and then took his train to Ravensbrück, where there was a big sanatorium a few miles away, and the sanatorium at Leichen had been used by the elite SS as their headquarters, and Ravensbrück was right outside Fürstenberg, where there was a busy airfield. A week later, on the 20th of March, Hitler had Gotthard Heinrichi relieve Himmler as commander of the army of the Vistula, and Heidegger told Gotthard that Himmler had stepped down for health reasons, just in case word got out that Himmler had been at the Leichen sanatorium because the SS headquarters at Ravensbrück was something of a secret. Hitler's trademark had been to compartmentalize his government by keeping them separate from each other. And Hitler would not tell one section what another section was doing, and in this way he not only encouraged competition between them, but also kept all power in his own hands. Gotthard had been appointed the day after Hitler announced his scorched earth decree on the 19th of March, called his Nero Command, and it was issued 4 days after Eich's decision to refuse any further support for Monty's single-thrust strategy. The following day, Himmler had a hit squad flown into Aachen on the 20th of March that parachuted out of a captured B-17 bomber, and this squad killed the mayor of Aachen on the 25th of March, and the 6 people in the squad had trained at Hürtgen Castle that was 25 miles southeast of Venlo, and they had trained there as part of the Werewolves program. Venlo was on the Meuse River 50 miles north of Liège, and Venlo was 25 miles south of Wiesel, with its only remaining bridge over the River Rhine, and Monty had started planning his Operation Plunder on the 16th of March that was launched on the 23rd of March, with 4,000 guns firing for 4 hours on Wiesel. And by the 27th of March, the British had a bridgehead across the Rhine that was 35 miles wide and 20 miles deep. Cologne was on the Rhine River 40 miles west over the hills from Liège, and Hürtgen Castle was 15 miles north of Cologne and 5 miles away from the Rhine River, and Monty cabled Eich on the 27th of March to say he would be marching in 2 days towards Berlin, but would set up his command post first in Hanover. Monty reached Hanover on the 10th of April, where there was, quote, a suspicious concentration of SS divisions on the southern flanks, close quote, Bradley, page 523. The Elbe River, cut through Europe at a 45-degree angle, starting in Czechoslovakia at the same latitude as Paris, and heading downstream northwest through Dresden and Torgau and Magdeburg, where it took a sharp turn to the north, 60 miles away from Berlin, keeping northward for 60 miles, until resuming its 45-degree angle northwest towards Hamburg, where it reached the North Sea 100 miles later. Eich's choice for the border in southern Germany between the Russians and the Americans was at Torgau on the Elbe River, because it was a clear landmark that kept the danger of friendly fire down to a minimum. Monty agreed to the Elbe because as it veered northwest towards the North Sea, the Elbe went right through Hanover, where Monty was heading, and Berlin was 150 miles due east of Hanover. Monty wanted to end up in Berlin in the last days of the war to sign his separate peace and join with the Germans to fight Russia. But first Monty needed to get to Berlin, and to get there he had to fool Patton, and Patton was nobody's fool. If Eisenhower were to devise a safe plan for juncture between the East and the West, he dared not defer it much longer, for any recommendation from Schaeff would have to be forwarded to the Kremlin. Like Eisenhower, I was unwilling to trust in prearranged recognition signals, even less in the use of radio contact with the Reds. Such signals were likely to be confused, and radio contact would be impaired by an impossible language barrier. It was partly this fear of running head-on into a single British division at Falaise that had induced me to halt Patton's forces at Argenton. Now, with almost 100 times as many forces spread from the North Sea to Switzerland, I shuddered at the prospect of a collision that might easily flare into a fight. Bradley, page 518 and 19. Although Churchill protested Eisenhower's radio to Moscow as an unwarranted intrusion by the military into a political problem, he reserved his angriest vituperation for the plan Eisenhower had proposed. The Prime Minister, according to Eisenhower, was, quote, greatly disappointed and disturbed, close quote, that Schaeff had not reinforced Montgomery with American troops and pointed him towards Berlin in a desperate effort to capture that city before the Russians took it. Bradley, page 521. Eich wrote to Stalin on March 28th that the Americans would not advance on Berlin, and Churchill hollered that Eich was not allowed to address another head of state, and Eich replied that he was speaking to Stalin as a fellow army commander rather than as a head of state. Churchill was hoping to scare the Americans about the oncoming Russians, but the first concentration camps were being overrun and the mood towards Germany had tightened, and Eich wasn't biting. Montgomery was reduced to mere flank support for the Ninth Army on its way to Leipzig under American rather than British command, and that foreclosed Monty's drive to Berlin, while the British continued to object to Eich's authority and to his direct communication with the Russians. On the night of March 28, BCOS chambers at Whitehall rang with indignation over Eisenhower's redundant demotion of Montgomery in the message and the surprise news of his plans to return Bradley Simpson's Ninth Army, which he had, quote-unquote, intended to keep with Montgomery. In his diary, Brooke chronicled the anger in the BCOS over Eisenhower's plan, which Brooke called, quote, unintelligible, unauthorized, and a clear breach of promise, in relegating Montgomery to a quote-unquote static mission. Eisenhower at War, page 741. Montgomery bitterly complained to Brooke about the loss of Simpson's Ninth Army, which would confine the 21st Army Group to a holding action. Churchill addressed a stream of messages to Eisenhower and Roosevelt to protest Montgomery's demotion and criticized for the record what he took to be Eisenhower's decision to foreclose Berlin as an Allied objective. Eisenhower at War, page 743. On the 3rd of April, Ike took the American Ninth Army out from under Monty's command, and the American 84th Infantry Division. On the 3rd of April, Ike took the American Ninth Army out from under Monty's command, and the American 84th Infantry Division captured the capital city of Hanover, arriving just before Monty and staying there to keep an eye on the British. On the 3rd of April, Ike took the American Ninth Army out from under Monty's command, and the American 84th Infantry, I don't know why I can't say that, 84th Infantry Division, captured the capital city of Hanover, arriving just before Monty and staying there to keep an eye on the British. The day after Remagen was taken, Schaeff ordered me to restrict our commitment in the bridgehead initially to 4 divisions. No more could be spared if we were to deadline a reserve as Monty had proposed of 10 additional divisions to be used by him in the event he smashed through the enemy crust on his northern crossing. I thereupon instructed Hodges to expand his bridgehead approximately 1,000 yards each day, barely enough to keep the enemy from mining and entrenching around that foothold. There Hodges was to wait until Eisenhower reached a decision on the southern crossing. If Ike approved our plan for the double thrust, I would have Hodges break out of Remagen and head southeast to join up with Patton's attack through Frankfurt. Bradley, page 503. Even before Hodges' bold tankers raced across the planked roadway of the Remagen Bridge to yank the wires that ran to the demolitions, that structure had been damaged by a German attempt to blow it up. And almost as soon as we crossed, the German turned his air and artillery against it. To protect the bridgehead and speed reinforcements to the far shore, First Army engineers threw a treadway bridge, then a pontoon bridge across the swollen Rhine. Naval units unloaded LCVPs from the giant trailers that had carried them from the channel and initiated a ferry service for the transport of supply. AA moved in concentration of guns half again as dense as that on the Normandy beachhead. Booms were laced upstream across the river to guard against submersibles and radio-controlled mines, and on either end of the bridge, patrols were established to prevent saboteurs from working their way into our columns crossing the bridge. Barrage balloons tugged at their cables from the hills on both sides of the river, and depth charges were dropped in the river to prevent frogmen from slipping through. Bradley Ibid. Finally, on March 17, the structure swayed, buckled, and then collapsed into the Rhine. Of the 200 engineers who were struggling to repair it at the time, more than a score were crushed in the crackling girders. Others were drowned as the collapsing bridge flung them into the icy Rhine. Had the structure held just another 24 hours, engineers estimated the span could have been saved. Nevertheless, by now Hodges had established a firm grip on his Remagen bridgehead. He had crowded 4 divisions into the foothold while expanding it to reach the double-laned Autobahn that led towards Frankfurt. Bradley, page 504. Except for the desperate delaying tactics of die-hard Nazis and the SS, enemy opposition slackened as our Allied line bulged from the Bavarian footholds in the south across the flowering mustard fields to Hanover, only 150 miles from Berlin. Bradley, page 517. The last German illusions of stalemate and the prospects of negotiated peace had been crushed by the weight of our army and the impressive wealth of Allied equipment. Until the week we spanned the Rhine at Remagen, some of the enemy still clung to a last thin hope that the newly developed German jets might yet neutralize the Allied superiority in the air. Top priorities had been assigned the production of jet aircraft, and already the enemy was believed to have manufactured in underground plants between 600 and 800 of these fast interceptors. Even in March 1945, production was estimated at 200 jet aircraft per month. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had issued recalls for trained airmen from the army, and at a half-dozen aerodromes, jet pilots were being trained. But like Hitler's V-weapons, the jets had come too late. Had von Rundstedt succeeded in stalemating the Allied ground offense in his Bulge attack, the enemy might then have exploited his jet advantage, but as our armies swarmed over the Rhineland, encircled the Ruhr, and headed east, we overran his underground plants before those jets could join the battle. Bradley, page 518. The Ludendorff bridge at Remagen had not been blown because the Germans were supposed to use it to come back into France after the negotiated separate peace. But the French First Army cut off the German retreat into Switzerland through the Swabian highlands, spoiling what was left of the British plan.